In our previous lecture, we studied creation myths of the ancient Near East and focused on a set of myths from Mesopotamia and from Egypt. And these myths surveyed both the creation of humanity and the creation of the world as a whole. In this lecture, I'd like to move from creation myths to a different sort of myth, to myths in which the battles of the gods are recounted. And for this purpose, we will move from Egypt and Mesopotamia to Syria and Canaan and look at a myth from the great city of Ugarit, a myth which is incorporated in a set of tales that modern scholars call the epics of the gods. Now, the form that this epic appears in is quite unique to the region. So here again, we have influences from the outer reaches, from Egypt, from Mesopotamia, but we have local indigenous culture forms, just as we have influences of religious ideas. The pantheons of the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians, their many gods influence the religious ideas of Syria and Canaan, but again, they have their own distinctive character. El, Baal, and Asherah were among the gods of the pantheon of the Canaanites, and their interactions and exploits and battles were often vengeful, fierce, and very passionate. These are not stories of gentle deities. Everything here is very forcefully put, and the emotions are very strongly felt. The tablets on which these epics were written were discovered in the 1920s and 30s. They revolutionized the study of the ancient Near East and of the Bible's literary background. And they can also give us information about the issue of how much the Israelites knew about the Canaanite myths and Canaanite worship. Now, I mentioned there was a pantheon of gods and that it absorbed influences. And this city, Ugarit, in which we find the records of these epics, was a city that both absorbed influence and then, creating its own cultural synthesis, disseminated this culture to other city-states and other areas. I've mentioned in an earlier lecture the discovery of this city in 1929 by a peasant plowing his field. I won't go into that story again, but I will mention again the role that accident plays in these great discoveries. The tale I'm going to tell you today was discovered through an accident. That is, this farmer was plowing his field and realized there was something there that was ancient. Two other great discoveries from the ancient Near East, the Amarna letters, discovered in 1887. The Amarna letters, in which we learn about Queen Nefertiti and her husband Akhenaten, and the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947. Both of these were discovered by accident. The Amarna letters by a peasant woman, and the Dead Sea Scrolls by a Bedouin shepherd. Each of these discoveries revealed documents that indicated previously unconsidered cultural artifacts, texts, sculpture, idols that were worship, and each of them also revealed interconnections because the character of ancient Near Eastern civilization was ecumenical. It was interconnected. It was not isolated. The mail was better in the ancient world than it is now, there's no doubt, and cultural connection was as strong. There were, for example, in the city-states of the ancient Near East in the period I'm going to speak of today, visiting scholars, visiting scribes, visiting professors who would go from one city-state to another and from one country to another, tell tales, translate documents, and a kind of comparative view of the ancient world emerges from our research into these ancient cultures. So again, not isolation, but interconnection. Ugarit, through its archives, was revealed as a sophisticated international trading center, and its scribes produced many myths. These myths and other documents, such as commercial documents, treaties, reveal Ugarit's connections to Egypt, Assyria, the Hittites, and other peoples we're going to speak of in our series. And texts were found in 8 different languages. So I want you to get the picture of this international center. The scribes in that city were truly multilingual, and important for the history of writing, a subject that we keep coming back to when we study the ancient Near East. Ugarit had one of the first alphabets. Now, it wasn't the same alphabet that later gets disseminated to the Greeks. It was an alphabet that used the cuneiform system, but it was a small number of letters, 30 letters. At times, this went down to 22 letters, in which you had one symbol equaling one sound. So this is the background of the alphabet emerging from the city of Ugarit. Our text, the Epic of the Gods, tells of Baal, the young god, and his conquests of the other gods and powers, because we have the gods. We also have what the texts refer to as dragons or monsters, some intermediate stage between the worldly and the divine. We have El, who was the head of the pantheon, and Asherah, his consort. We've met Asherah before in a number of different guises. She's the goddess who was worshipped in the tree groves, and her symbol was a wooden staff resembling a tree. Among their many children was the young god Baal, the god of fertility and the god of rain, on whom fertility in that area depends. At one point, Baal usurps the power of the father god. We saw this in the Babylonian epic with the story of Marduk. Here we're seeing it in Canaan. There is an elder god who's removed. There's a young god who wants power, and he stages what in modern terms we would call a coup. He takes over, and the older god retreats. A war in heaven is brewing. And in this war, Baal is challenged by Yam, dragon of the sea. Yam, the biblical Hebrew word for sea. Here we have its cognate, its parallel in the language of Ugarit, but not as a geographical denotation, not as the great water, but rather the dragon who lives in the great water, the sea monster, we would say. So Yam is challenging the young god Baal after Baal has emerged as the champion of the gods. And Ishtar, also known as Astarte, Ishtar, Astarte, or Ashtoret in the Hebrew Bible, who is one of Baal's many consorts, tries to stop the dragon, tries to dissuade him from engaging in the war. Now, the dragon will stop his conflict with the young god Baal if the goddess gives herself to him. This is a familiar narrative move in these documents where there's some attempted seduction, there's attraction, there's repulsion, there's actually a phrase that we would not really recognize today theologically. We could speak of the sexuality of the gods. They have these passions and they act on them. Now, in order for the sea dragon to want the goddess, he has to see the goddess. And how does this happen? And let me read you from a prose rendering of this great epic. A palace was built for Yam as a sign that he was king. But Yam proved to be a greedy king, demanding tribute from all the gods and the goddesses. They were powerless to overcome the dragon Yam. So then Ishtar, Astarte, appeared and volunteered to go down to the sea to entreat the dragon to have mercy. So it's her idea, it's the goddess's idea to confront the monster. The gods approved the plan, so Ishtar removed her clothes, scented herself with rich perfumes, and went down to the sea. When the dragon heard her music, he came to the surface and inquired why she had come to him. So she's the one who attracts the attention of the god. Now watch what happens. I have come to entreat you, she replied, to have mercy on the gods and goddesses. Don't fight them, lighten their burden. Yam was charmed by the beauty of the goddess and answered, Goddess of beauty, if you will surrender yourself to me and become my mistress, I will ease the burden of the gods and the goddesses. Well, the goddess wanted to charm the dragon, but she didn't want to stay with him. A familiar scenario. So she refuses him. And this does not go over well. Yam is enraged, and Baal, the young champion of the gods, he's enraged that the sea dragon lusts after his woman. So the only thing that can happen now is a war breaks out. Well, Astarte, Ishtar, still is engaged. Now, what's interesting is that she's not relegated to being the seductress, and that's the end of the story. She's still engaged. What does she do? She goes to the great craftsman or artisan, Kothar, and she asks for weapons that will kill a dragon. Baal, her consort, receives these weapons, and he gives a blow to the dragon, and the dragon is left for dead. So the gods not only have passions, they also have armament makers. They have masters of war. They have people who will supply arms, and they have artisans who will make them. In fact, sometimes there's an aesthetic about these armaments. They want the most beautiful bow, the grandest sword. So with these arms, Baal bests the dragon and thinks that the dragon is dead. But in truth, the dragon lives in some suspended state. And this is suspected by another female protagonist of our story, the goddess Anat. Anat realizes that the dragon is not dead, and using her own arts of war, she kills him. Now, with the help of Asherah and Anat, the two goddesses, Baal is established as the king of the gods, and there doesn't seem to be any challenge to him, and his kingdom is secure. This point that the reader and the listener, because these are tales that were told, the listener might expect the story to end. Well, there was a fight among the gods. One young god emerged triumphant. Then that young god was challenged by a great monster, a great dragon, and with the help of his goddesses, he won. Now there can be a reign of peace, not only of peace, of prosperity, because Baal is the god of rain, rain in its time, the correct rain, dew, light rain, heavy rain, in the right season. Okay, now we can have the peaceable kingdom. And zap, something else comes into the story. This is the literary art. When you think that things are quiescent, something else happens. What happens? There's another threat to peace, prosperity, and the kingship of Baal. And this is in the figure, the person of another god, a god who's not distant like the sea dragon, the god Mot, the god of death. Again, the cognate to the Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, Mavet, or Maut, death. Now, not only death of the individual human, but death as personified as a god who can climb into your residence and take away the inhabitants, take them to the land of the dead. Something about this from the epic. Baal stood proudly in his palace, contemplating his kingdom and glorying in his undisputed reign over the earth. But even as he did so, he thought of another rival, Mot, the spirit of death and drought, whom he had ignored. So Mot is death, it could be illness, it can be someone's death, but of course the most dangerous in this culture is the death of the earth. There's drought, the crops dry up, the cities die, the people die. Perhaps Mot has designs upon my kingdom, he thought. He sent two messengers to the netherworld with the message that his domain, the domain of Mot, was in the netherworld, and that he, Mot, should not think about challenging Baal. Mot replied, Baal sits on his throne in comfort, wrapped in the garment of heaven, while I am imprisoned in this dark and dirty place. Tell your master to come down here and face me with that message. I will give him a feast to remember. Kind of like a Clint Eastwood movie. Like, make my day, right? Come on, give me trouble. Now, at this juncture, let us stop and think about interpretation of myth. We've had this contest among the gods. We've had the sea dragon threaten the young god. Now we have death, crop failure, threatening the god. This is the much more serious threat. And to contextualize it, we need to remember that we're comparing this culture to the culture of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Egypt has crops on a regular basis. As the great historian, traveler to Egypt, Herodotus, said, Egypt is the gift of the Nile. That is, without the Nile, there is no Egypt, because there is no food. And we know that in Mesopotamia, the Tigris and the Euphrates and the canals connecting them were used for irrigation. When the rivers inundated or rose, they deposited silt, and in that silt, crops could grow with great abundance, and the people always had food. Now, Canaan, sandwiched in between these two great cultures, does not have the food source that makes these cultures great, so it's vulnerable. This goes to explain something that we see in the Bible very often, that the people of Canaan need to go down into Egypt to get food when there's a famine, because a famine results from a drought. But Egypt is not susceptible to drought. So reliable rainfall is a matter of life and death. So thus we have the mythic expression of the concern over drought. So to return to our story, Mot threatens Baal's palace and his kingdom. Baal sits on his throne in heaven, Mot says. While I am imprisoned below, I dare him to come to the netherworld. Baal, out of the need to find a way to solve the problem of drought, goes down into the land of the dead. He goes into the underworld. He's captured, and he is now one of the dead. So the rains can never come back. The god of fertility has died. Anat, our heroine from earlier in the story, has the ability to go down into the underworld. She retrieves him and brings him back to life. Mot understands that even if he captures the god of fertility, some power will bring fertility back. So Mot cannot triumph, but Baal cannot triumph either. So the spheres gets separated. The sphere of the earthly, the sphere of daily life, the sphere of prosperity belongs to Baal. The sphere of the underworld, of the shades of the dead, belongs to Mot. And who can pass in between? Only the young gods and the goddesses. The message is clear. Humans cannot pass between the land of the dead and the land of the living. So while we're looking at the cosmological large story, we always have to remember the human story that lurks beyond it. This theme of the dying and resurrected God is one we find often in Near Eastern myth, but it's one that we need to be a bit cautious about. Because we find it in some myths, there is a tendency to generalize it to all myths, to say, oh, we have this theme, that's what this is all about. It's all about crops and the fear of the drought, and then the resurrection of the earth, and that people related this to the lives of the gods. Yes, we've just seen an instance where it's true. There are instances where there are other ideas at play. I mention this because some very important 19th and 20th century cultural works, I think of Sir James Fraser's The Golden Bough and the poems of T.S. Eliot, which are influenced by this work, focus on this idea of the dying and resurrected God in the ancient Near East. And of course, it was related by many people to the Christian idea. So we have a tie-in between Christianity and these ancient Near Eastern ideas, a very potent and attractive tie-in, but one about which we need to be somewhat cautious. So moving from theory back to story, let's read about Baal and the god of death. They meet in battle. It was long and fierce, first one triumphant and then the other. When it looked as if they would both drop from exhaustion, the sun, that's the sun god Shamash, saw them and cried out to Mot to cease from the battle and give up the attempt to deprive Baal of the throne, lest the gods destroy him completely. Mot was terrified and conceded victory to Baal. Baal is king, he cried. Baal, of course, was overjoyed and resumed his reign. The gods gathered and celebrated Baal's return to the throne with a grand banquet. Well, this must be the end of our story. The young god had many threats. Finally, the ultimate threat, death, came. He conquered death, or at least he relegated death to the netherworld. Now we're all going to be okay. By the way, this isn't only about the story, everything's going to be okay, but for the listeners, everything is going to be okay. It's their myth. It's the myth that tells them about the way they understand their own lives and their own culture. No, one of our heroes is now going to become a villain or a potential villain. And this is the goddess Anat. The goddess Anat, you'll recall, helped Baal. She's the goddess of war. But because she's the goddess of war, she can't desist from war. She's in the habit of war. As the text puts it, she set out on a wild rampage of slaughter and carnage, killing everyone in sight. The earth became a sea of blood. Why? Because she remembered that the people had not followed Mot. Humankind is imperfect. She's angry at people. The people had not known whether to follow Mot or Baal. People are fickle. She wants to kill them. Again, the theme of the gods kind of dispensing with the fate of humanity. Baal was distressed. It grieved him to think that now his throne was secure and the world was prosperous. Anat still was determined to make war and seek revenge. He sent word to the goddess that the time of warfare was past and that he was about to usher in a period of peace and goodwill. He summoned her to the holy mountain. The holy mountain in the texts is Zaphon or Tzafon, the great mountain of the north. The gods were worshipped on these mountains. And in places where there weren't mountains, they were worshipped on hills that were thought to be models of these great mountains where the gods were dwelling, much like the idea of Olympus in Greece. When Anat saw the messengers approaching, she concluded that another usurper was on the march, so she's always ready for war. She thought, I have to battle again, and Baal wants me to battle. But Baal tells her that there's no need for war. He wants to establish peace. He tells this to her by messenger. Anat went with the two envoys to the great mountain of the north. As they approached the holy hill, the skies opened and lightning split the heavens and thunder reverberated across the mountains. It was a sign to Anat that truly Baal was Lord of the earth and that the reign of peace had dawned. Now, for the ancients, prosperity could come. The drought could cease. The crops were plentiful, but war was always a threat. They didn't have a political analysis of war. They had a religious analysis of war, that the gods, in their fury, began to kill people, and then they were intoxicated or drunk on the carnage. And in a subsequent lecture, we will see how this image of being drunk on killing is used very beautifully. So prosperity is not enough. You must have peace. Of course, this is a lesson from the ancient world that many in the modern world think that we might hearken to. Now, listening to this story, the story of Baal and his battles with the sea dragon, with the god Mot, or death, with his problems with Anat, you will recall that in an earlier lecture, in which we mentioned many of these gods, we surveyed the biblical view of the gods. What does the Bible and the prophets of the Bible say about Baal, about Asherah? And it also refers to Anat. So let us return to those biblical selections. Let us recall them and see how we might fit that into what we've learned from this epic. In the book of Numbers, we read the story of Bala Worship. This occurred in a place called Baal Peor, and the Bible says there was this mix of what they called sexual transgression, sexual license, linked to Baal worship. Now, we think that this is a reference to the fertility cult, because Baal and the goddesses are signs of fertility. In order to bring fertility, the sexual act has to be reenacted in a sacred place. And we see this idea mentioned again and again in the biblical prophets. In the book of Kings, we read of the battle between Elijah, the priest or prophet of God, and the 450 priests who, quote, cried aloud to Baal, as was their custom. They cut themselves with swords and lances until the blood gushed out of them. So what do we have here? A picture of the cult mixed in with mutilation and the drawing of blood. Again, something that was thought to bring on fertility. And we read of King Josiah, the king of Judah in the 7th century BC, who reforms the temple cult. And what does he do? He throws out all the vessels made for Baal and Asherah and all the host of heaven. He burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields of Kidron. These are 3 of many references to the Canaanite gods, to the worship of Baal, and to the goddesses Asherah. The name Anat is mentioned, and Astarte, Ishtar, called in the Bible Ashtoret, is mentioned 40 times in the Hebrew Bible. So these are not obscure references. This is part of the fabric of biblical literature. These references indicate to scholars that Baal worship was widespread in certain periods of Israelite history. And we can assume, along with this worship, there was familiarity with the texts in which the epics were described. So many scholars assert that these biblical texts serve as a literary background to many of the biblical narratives. The picture we get from the biblical passages I cited and from many others is that the Canaanite deities were, quote, a temptation to the Israelites, one they were supposed to resist, but one that they found it hard to resist. And there's a debate among historians of religion about this depiction of the Canaanite gods as a temptation. Some scholars assert that this is a true reflection of the situation. Yes, the Israelites had a manifestly monotheistic religion, but they lapsed many times and they served the gods of the Canaanites. Others say that this is an exaggeration in the spirit, to make it more familiar to ourselves, of the Puritan sermons, or the great American sermon, Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God by Jonathan Edwards. That is, the sins were exaggerated in order to preach to the people. Now, the jury is still out about this. Do we know? Do we have evidence about the Israelite worship of the Canaanite gods? There is some archaeological evidence of a limited nature. Mostly we have to rely on the textual evidence. What does the Bible say about it? And the Bible asserts that these gods were being worshipped. In this lecture, we have studied the epic of the gods from the city of Ugarit and recounted the story of Baal and his conflict with the gods. We have referred that material to the stories in the Bible and the references to the worship of Baal and the Asherah. In our next lecture, we will begin the study of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the great epic of Mesopotamian civilization.